The atmospheric tension surrounding the nation's capital has reached a fever pitch, not due to the standard political maneuvering of the legislative branch, but because of a literal and metaphorical surge of toxicity that threatens the very geography of power. At the heart of this escalating crisis is a catastrophic failure of infrastructure within the Potomac Interceptor, a critical artery of the region's waste management system, which has fractured, sending a torrent of untreated effluent into the historic waters of the Potomac River. This is no longer merely a localized utility failure. It has transformed into a high-stakes geopolitical standoff, a fictionalized yet visceral theater of war between federal authority and state sovereignty. The initial reports indicated a collapse near Cabin John, Maryland, but the environmental fallout has quickly transcended municipal boundaries, turning the river into a graywater battlefield. The imagery of millions of gallons of waste encroaching upon the marble monuments of Washington, D.C., provides a grim backdrop for a narrative of systemic decay and institutional paralysis. While the physical leak is the immediate concern, the narrative surrounding the disaster has been weaponized by the highest levels of government, with the president launching a scathing public indictment against the Maryland executive leadership. This rhetoric characterizes the spill as the inevitable byproduct of a broader administrative incompetence, framing the ecological disaster as a definitive proof of concept for a failed partisan ideology. The verbal salvos being traded across the airwaves are indicative of a deeper, more fractured political landscape where even a public health emergency is filtered through the lens of electoral posturing and long-term ambition. As the sludge moved downstream, the rhetoric moved upstream, flooding the news cycle with accusations of criminal negligence and historic mismanagement. The president's direct intervention into the Maryland governor's handling of the crisis has signaled a total breakdown in intergovernmental cooperation. By labeling the state's response as a failure of leadership, the administration is effectively positioning itself as the only viable savior in a situation that is rapidly spiraling out of control. This strategic framing serves a dual purpose. It distracts from the complexities of federal funding gaps while simultaneously painting the Maryland governor, a rising figure often whispered about in the context of future national aspirations, as an ineffective bureaucrat incapable of protecting his own constituents. The president's insistence that he will be forced to mobilize federal assets to bypass state authority underscores a growing trend of centralized intervention, where the lines between assistance and takeover are becoming increasingly blurred. However, the optics of this intervention are complicated by the current state of federal emergency agencies. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, often the first line of defense in such disasters, finds itself in a state of financial limbo, caught in a legislative deadlock over Homeland Security funding. This creates a paradoxical situation where the president demands federal intervention while the very tools for that intervention are being withheld by a divided Congress demanding structural reforms. The result is a stalemate of shadow boxing, where the health of the Potomac and the safety of the million residents who rely on it for drinking water are treated as secondary to the accumulation of political capital. The response from the Maryland governor's office has been equally defiant, rejecting the federal narrative and pivoting the blame back toward the national government's longstanding jurisdictional responsibilities. According to the state's counter-argument, the Potomac Interceptor is not a state-managed asset, but a federal one, with oversight duties stretching back decades. This dispute over who owns the failure is at the core of the escalating tension. The governor's camp suggests that the president's vocal criticism is a tactical smokescreen designed to hide 4 weeks of federal inaction and a refusal to acknowledge the administration's own liability in the maintenance of regional infrastructure. This back and forth has created a feedback loop of blame that further complicates the logistics of the repair efforts. While the engineers and specialized crews attempt to stabilize the collapsed pipe in the treacherous terrain of Cabin John, they are doing so under a cloud of conflicting directives and public grandstanding. The ecological stakes are mounting. The Potomac is not just a scenic waterway, but a vital source of life for the surrounding ecosystems and human populations. The introduction of such a massive volume of sewage threatens to trigger a catastrophic hypoxic event, potentially destroying local fisheries and contaminating the water table for years to come. Yet, even as the biological clocks of the river's inhabitants tick toward a point of no return, the primary concern in the halls of power seems to be the management of the optic fallout rather than the hydraulic one. This fictionalized crisis has exposed the fragile architecture of the American administrative state, where the breakdown of a single pipe can trigger a constitutional tug-of-war. The president's public dismissals of the governor's capability are not just critiques of a single incident. They are part of a broader narrative of delegitimization. By suggesting that the governor can't fix anything, the administration is attempting to narrate a story of total state-level collapse, justifying a more aggressive federal footprint. Meanwhile, the governor's defense that Maryland has been the only entity actively working to protect residents and secure drinking water paints a picture of a state abandoned by a negligent federal parent. The friction between these two stories has created a vacuum of accountability. As citizens watch the news, they are presented with two irreconcilable realities. One where a rogue state executive is allowing an environmental catastrophe to fester, and another where an opportunistic federal government is using a maintenance failure to sabotage a political rival. The truth of the matter, buried beneath layers of partisan vitriol, is that the infrastructure of the nation is aging, and the mechanisms for its repair are being strangled by the very people tasked with its preservation. The standoff over the Potomac is a microcosm of a larger national malaise where the basic functions of government, protecting the environment and ensuring public health, are being sacrificed on the altar of the 24-hour news cycle and the relentless pursuit of the next election cycle. The river continues to flow, carrying with it the evidence of a system that is breaking down as much from the inside as it is from the outside. The escalation of this environmental standoff has moved beyond the banks of the Potomac and into the sterile, high-stakes briefing rooms of the Capitol, where the atmospheric pressure is almost as palpable as the rising toxicity in the water. As the sun rises over the tainted river, the physical reality of the sewage plume continues its southward creep, a slow-motion disaster that the federal government now claims is a direct result of state-level paralysis. The administration's narrative has pivoted toward a more aggressive stance, suggesting that the governor of Maryland has not only failed to contain the leak at the Potomac Interceptor, but has actively obstructed federal oversight to shield his own political future. This accusation of obstructionism adds a new layer of legal and constitutional complexity to the fictional crisis, transforming a maintenance failure into a potential case of criminal negligence at the executive level. The president's rhetoric has become increasingly personal, stripping away the traditional decorum of intergovernmental relations to paint a picture of a statehouse in total disarray. By focusing on the governor's purported incompetence, the federal narrative seeks to preemptively absolve the national agencies of any blame for the 4-week delay in response, despite the fact that the jurisdictional lines governing the Potomac Interceptor remain a matter of intense legal debate. Behind the scenes, the logistical nightmare of the repair operation is being hampered by the very political friction played out on the news. Specialized dive teams and environmental engineers tasked with the Herculean effort of patching a high-pressure interceptor collapse under several meters of water and silt report a chaotic chain of command. Orders issued by federal contractors are frequently countermanded by state environmental regulators, leading to a standstill where no meaningful progress can be made. This administrative gridlock is occurring as the chemical composition of the river shifts, with nitrogen and phosphorus levels reaching unprecedented heights. The specter of a massive fish kill looms over the Chesapeake Bay, an ecological catastrophe that would devastate the regional economy and destroy the livelihoods of thousands of watermen. Yet, the public discourse remains focused on the blame game, a term that has become a staple of the hourly updates. The administration's refusal to release FEMA funds, citing the ongoing legislative battle over homeland security and border policy, has created a financial bottleneck that the Maryland governor's office claims is a deliberate attempt to bankrupt the state's emergency response. The governor's counteroffensive has centered on a historical reconstruction of the Interceptor's management, presenting a timeline that points directly to federal neglect. Spokespeople for the state have released internal memos suggesting that Maryland officials warned of structural vulnerabilities in the Cabin-John section as early as 3 years ago, only to have those concerns dismissed by federal budget offices. This paper trail is being used to frame the president's current outrage as a form of gaslighting, an attempt to rewrite the history of the infrastructure's decay to suit a contemporary political agenda. The state's argument is that the federal government is the landlord of this specific utility, and as such, the responsibility for its catastrophic failure lies solely at the feet of the national administration. This defensive posture is not just about environmental policy, it is a fight for political survival. With the governor being touted as a premier challenger for the 2028 cycle, the stakes of this disaster are existential. A failure to manage a localized spill could be the stain that follows him onto the national stage, a vulnerability the president seems keen to exploit with surgical precision. As the standoff enters its second month, the humanitarian concerns are beginning to outweigh the political theater. Residents in the affected jurisdictions are facing a looming water crisis, with municipal intake valves being monitored for any sign of fecal coliform bacteria or chemical pollutants. The fear of a widespread public health emergency has led to a run on bottled water and a general sense of abandonment among the citizenry. The president's schedule, while packed with closed-door meetings and high-profile events, has notably lacked a visit to the site of the disaster, a detail the Maryland executive team has highlighted as proof of a lack of genuine concern for the forgotten voters of the Potomac Basin. This absence has allowed the governor to dominate the visual landscape of the crisis, appearing in waders and hard hats alongside local workers, projecting an image of hands-on leadership that contrasts sharply with the president's televised denunciations from the safety of the Oval Office. This battle of optics is a crucial component of the story, as both sides understand that in the modern era, the perception of action is often more influential than the action itself. The underlying tension is further exacerbated by the broader context of the Homeland Security funding fight. The president's refusal to decouple the sewage crisis from the larger partisan struggle over departmental reforms has effectively taken the Potomac hostage. By insisting that FEMA cannot move until the opposition party yields on unrelated policy demands, the administration is utilizing a scorched earth tactic that leaves the state of Maryland in a precarious position. The governor's supporters have decried this as a form of domestic extortion, where the health of millions is used as a bargaining chip in a game of legislative chicken. Conversely, the administration's allies argue that the governor is merely seeking a federal bailout for his own fiscal mismanagement, attempting to socialize the costs of Maryland's deteriorating infrastructure. This circular logic ensures that as the effluent continues to pour into the river at a rate of hundreds of gallons per hour, the flow of solutions remains completely blocked by a dam of political ego and strategic calculation. The river, once a symbol of national unity and a gateway to the interior, has become a literal sewer of partisan discord, reflecting the darkest impulses of a divided government. The friction between the state and federal authorities has reached a terminal velocity, manifesting in a series of legal injunctions and public denunciations that have effectively paralyzed the emergency response infrastructure. As the third phase of this fictional crisis unfolds, the environmental data coming from the Potomac Basin suggests a tipping point is imminent. Independent monitors operating outside the embattled state and federal agencies have begun reporting a significant spike in hazardous pathogens trailing downstream toward the Chesapeake. Yet, the discourse in the Capitol remains focused on the power dynamics of the 2028 election cycle rather than the biological integrity of the Mid-Atlantic watershed. The president's administration has doubled down on its narrative of state-level negligence, framing the governor of Maryland as an executive who is playing politics with the lives of his citizens by refusing to cede operational control to federal overseers. This rhetorical strategy is designed to create a catch-22 for the State House. If the governor accepts federal intervention, he admits to his own inability to manage the crisis. If he refuses, he is cast as the villain obstructing a solution. This tactical encirclement has forced the governor into a defensive posture, where every press conference is a meticulously choreographed exercise in blame shifting and jurisdictional defense. The complexity of the subterranean collapse at Cabin John has become a metaphor for the opacity of the modern administrative state. Engineers on the ground describe the Interceptor as a massive aging concrete artery that was never designed to handle the modern load of an expanding metropolitan corridor. Its failure was not an accident of nature, but a predictable consequence of decades of deferred maintenance, a slow-motion catastrophe that both the state and federal governments have spent years ignoring. Now that the pipe has finally buckled, the cost of repair has skyrocketed, exacerbated by the need for specialized deep-water bypass systems that only a few private contractors in the country possess. These contractors are currently sitting idle in regional staging areas, refusing to deploy their heavy equipment until a definitive line of credit is established. Because FEMA remains sidelined by the ongoing legislative battle over Homeland Security reforms, and because the Maryland state budget is already stretched thin by emergency containment efforts, the financial vacuum has become the primary obstacle to progress. The water continues to darken, and the stench of untreated waste has begun to waft over the affluent neighborhoods lining the riverbanks, serving as a visceral reminder of the government's inability to provide the most basic of public services. Inside the West Wing, the strategy has shifted toward a broader indictment of the governor's entire tenure. Rumors are being circulated regarding the misallocation of prior infrastructure grants, suggesting that funds intended for the Potomac Interceptor were diverted into vanity projects or green energy initiatives favored by the governor's base. While these allegations remain unproven in this narrative, They serve as potent ammunition in the court of public opinion, successfully muddying the waters of accountability. The governor's team has countered by highlighting the president's own vetoes of clean water legislation, painting the administration as an anti-regulatory regime that has systematically dismantled the very agencies tasked with preventing such disasters. This exchange of historical grievances has turned the nightly news into a chronological audit of past failures, leaving the current crisis to fester in real time. The governor's spokesperson recently released a scathing statement asserting that the federal government is squatting on its responsibilities, using a national asset, the Potomac, as a tool for political assassination. The level of animosity has reached a point where direct communication between the two leaders has ceased entirely, with all messages being filtered through hostile legal counsel and televised sound bites. As the physical contamination spreads, a new and more dangerous element has entered the story: the threat to the regional power grid. Several major cooling stations for data centers and power plants located along the river rely on a steady supply of treated water. The high concentration of solid waste and corrosive chemicals now present in the Potomac has forced these facilities to operate at reduced capacity to avoid equipment failure. The prospect of rolling blackouts in the nation's capital, triggered by a sewage spill in Maryland, has elevated the situation from an environmental nuisance to a national security concern. This escalation provides the president with the legal pretext to invoke emergency powers that could strip the governor of his authority over the disaster zone. The administration is reportedly drafting an executive order that would declare the Potomac Basin a federal exclusion zone, effectively placing the entire region under the jurisdiction of the Department of Defense's Civil Works branch. Such a move would be an unprecedented assertion of federal power over state lands, setting the stage for a constitutional showdown that could take years to resolve in the courts, long after the river has been irreparably damaged. The irony of the situation is not lost on the residents of the Potomac Valley, who find themselves caught in the middle of a struggle between two men who are both ostensibly working for the public good. The governor's attempts to bypass the federal funding block by seeking private donations and international aid have been met with derision from the administration, which labeled the move pathetic and illegal. Meanwhile, the president's closed-door events, mentioned in earlier reports, are rumored to be strategy sessions with regional governors from the opposing party, discussing how to isolate Maryland and prevent the contagion of incompetence from crossing state lines. This regional balkanization is a disturbing development, suggesting that the federal system is no longer a cohesive unit, but a collection of warring fiefdoms defined by their proximity to the center of power. The river, which once bridged the divide between North and South, is now a liquid border between two competing visions of American governance. As Section 3 draws to a close, the first reports of localized water rationing have begun to surface in the suburbs of Virginia and D.C., signaling that the sewage situation has officially transitioned from a headline into a daily, grinding reality for millions of people who never thought their tap water would become a casualty of a political feud. The conclusion of this fictional infrastructure crisis has transitioned from a localized utility failure into a total systemic collapse of intergovernmental cooperation, with the Potomac River serving as the silent witness to a broken Federalist model. As the fourth and final act of this narrative unfolds, the physical breach at the Cabin John Interceptor remains unsealed, a jagged wound in the earth that continues to bleed millions of gallons of waste into the regional water supply. The political fallout, however, has finally superseded the environmental damage in the national consciousness. The president's administration has moved to formally invoke emergency executive authorities, bypassing the Maryland governor's office entirely under the guise of national security. This maneuver, justified by the growing threat to the region's data centers and power cooling infrastructure, represents the ultimate escalation of the failure of leadership narrative. By deploying military engineering units to the site, the federal government has effectively occupied a piece of state territory, framing the intervention not as a helping hand, but as a necessary seizure of control from an incompetent subordinate. This visual of federal troops and heavy machinery rolling into the Maryland suburbs has provided the ultimate optics for the evening news, cementing the president's image as a decisive commander taking charge where a 2028 hopeful allegedly faltered. The governor of Maryland, stripped of operational command over the disaster site, has pivoted his strategy toward a high-stakes legal and rhetorical insurgency. In a final, defiant broadcast from the state capitol, the governor's administration characterized the federal takeover as a hostile administrative coup designed to bankrupt the state and sabotage a political rival. The governor's legal team has filed an emergency suit with the Supreme Court, arguing that the president's use of the Homeland Security funding deadlock as a pretext for seizing state assets is a violation of the 10th Amendment. This legal battle has created a constitutional stalemate that may last for years, long after the immediate smell of sewage has dissipated from the Potomac. The tragedy of this fictional standoff is that while the lawyers and politicians argue over jurisdictional boundaries, the ecological recovery of the river has been estimated to take over a decade. The massive influx of nitrogen and phosphorus has triggered a feedback loop of toxic algae blooms that are now visible from satellite imagery, a neon green stain stretching from the outskirts of Washington, D.C., down to the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. This environmental scar is the permanent legacy of a month of inaction, a physical manifestation of the toxicity that has come to define the relationship between the State House and the West Wing. The human cost of this deadlock has finally reached a breaking point, as the closed-door meetings mentioned in early reports have yielded a grim reality for the residents of the Potomac Basin. Water treatment facilities throughout the region have reached their filtration limits, leading to the first mandatory boil water orders in the history of the nation's capital and its surrounding affluent suburbs. The irony of the world's most powerful city being unable to provide clean tap water to its citizens is a narrative beat that has resonated globally, tarnishing the international prestige of the administration. Yet the president remains undeterred, using his final public appearances of the week to remind voters that this crisis was made in Maryland and fixed by Washington. This persistent branding of the disaster as a partisan failure has successfully polarized the electorate. Half the country views the president as a hero who stepped in to save a dying river, while the other half views him as an opportunist who manufactured a crisis to destroy a political opponent. The truth, as is often the case in this fictionalized landscape, is buried under layers of strategic messaging and the relentless churn of the 24-hour news cycle. As the engineering crews finally begin the arduous process of sleeving the collapsed pipe, the financial cost of the operation has ballooned into the billions. Because the FEMA funding remains locked in a legislative vault, the administration has resorted to emergency reprogramming of funds from other departments, a move that the opposition party has labeled illegal and a gross misuse of taxpayer dollars. This ensures that even as the physical leak is stopped, the political leak will continue to drain the Capitol's energy for the foreseeable future. The Maryland governor, while wounded by the optics of the federal takeover, has found a new base of support among those who fear federal overreach, positioning himself as a martyr for state sovereignty. The 2028 election cycle, though years away, has been irrevocably shaped by the sludge of the Potomac. The sewage situation has become a shorthand for everything wrong with the current state of governance, a world where infrastructure is a weapon, the environment is a casualty, and accountability is a ghost. In the final analysis of this story, the restoration of the Potomac Interceptor is merely a temporary patch on a much deeper structural failure. The river may eventually clear, and the fish may one day return to the waters near Cabin John. But the trust between the various levels of government has been permanently eroded. The narrator of this tale, remaining anonymous behind the shield of objective reporting, observes a landscape where the primary goal of leadership is no longer the preservation of the common good, but the total annihilation of the opposition's credibility. As the sun sets on the final day of the crisis, the president and the governor continue to trade barbs through their respective media channels, each claiming victory in a war that everyone has lost. The story concludes not with a resolution, but with a warning that in the pursuit of power, even the most basic necessities of life, water, air, and safety, are considered expendable. The Potomac continues to flow toward the sea, carrying with it the remnants of a month-long battle that proved once and for all that when the systems of power fail, it is the people and the land that pay the ultimate price.